said you entered into a bout of agnosticism. What pushed you back into faith?
I think beginning to work in the autumn of life, very favourite time for Jungians, with people who are suffering major life-threatening illnesses, initially cancer. My early research was on a psychoanalytic approach to breast cancer, both behaviour and the outcome of the disease, and then HIV/AIDS, and encountering people, particularly when I was working in the United States, at their deathbeds, confronting sheer terror in the face of premature death at an early age. It was quite clear to me that we couldn't just bypass, by telling people to change their thoughts, major issues of immortality, self-continuity, and whether there was something beyond this life. And that brought about rather a major transformation in my own consciousness. It seemed to me that, having studied Jung particularly, that there was something archetypal, universal, timeless and transcultural about the human quest, both for meaning and for some kind of numinous experience, even if it was not the experience of an encounter with a God clothed in parental garments.
Well, David, hasn't the modern effort to understand mental illness been a movement away from religion toward a scientific understanding of mental states?
Yes, that's right. The modern medical approach to mental illness has been a movement away from the religious and spiritual sensibility, and that's because the religious and the spiritual have been seen as vague and nebulous and impossible to prove, and science has wanted to argue that mental illness is the result of environmental factors or traumas in early childhood, chemical imbalances in the brain, and these sorts of things. But I think what we see now in medicine is this feeling that there's something missing. And that's why we see so many conferences around Australia at the moment on spirituality and medicine and spirituality and mental health, because medical practitioners and psychiatrists are only too aware, actually, of the fact that the purely material approach to mental illness, while often having some impact, of course, and medication often has wonderful effects, but it rarely gets to the root causes of the problem. And so that's why I think it's now time for the modern approach to mental illness to revisit the ancient models, which included the spirit and the soul.
Can I begin with you, Peter, and talk about the experience that illness and dealing with people who were ill led you back into an examination of God and a new sort of wider idea of belief?
Yes, well, I'd like to put this very quickly into a historical and cultural framework. Firstly, when I was at the University of California in San Francisco, and then later in Sydney at St Vincent's, I was working with usually young men between 20 and 40 who were facing a very stigmatised disease and the reality of death, usually within 3 years of diagnosis. Many had had orthodox religious backgrounds, but had, for various reasons, lost their faith. Now confronted with death in the first half rather than the autumn of life, they found themselves revisiting either the religion of the past or those ultimate questions which rise in the face of undeniable death, because it was a terminal diagnosis in those days. Is there something to support me through this? Is there continuity? Do I have some sense of continuing beyond death? And where am I at in my relationship with God? What do we mean by God today? So I would explore with them, without using all the jargon, the experiences of the mystics, of Hildegard of Bingen, of Julian of Norwich, of Teresa of Avila and St John of the Cross particularly, as well as teaching them, helping them to learn to meditate rather than to go back to formulaic prayers from childhood, to enter more of a space of exploring within for connection with something numinous, and working with dreams and symbols emerging in dreams as well as meditative states as some clue to what the numinous might be for them. And I would like to share this with all of you. I sat at many deathbeds. I lost count of the number. And this was before I had my own near-death experience and sense of what presence and being might be like after death. And there was not one deathbed at which I sat where the person, no matter what horror and turmoil I had been through, in the last moments did not die in great peace. And it was funny, as I was sitting at the bedside, this is getting back to something that you were saying, I experienced in one moment an animated body, a presence, almost something divine. And then it was as if almost a light source was leaving the room, and I was confronted with a corpse, no longer animated, and now quite horrible to look at in its disfigurement and emaciation, whereas previously I hadn't seen the emaciation or the disfigurement, but only a human being and a presence. And I thought, by God, if we want anecdotal evidence for the existence of a spirit or God, surely this must come something near it.
Wonderful.
So that's very experiential, not scientific. I was doing multivariate scientific research studies at the same time into the fact it's influencing outcome. But these experiences were what brought me personally and forever, I think, much closer to an experience of the numinous and back into my valuing of the priceless treasure of Catholicism. So I began to enjoy again liturgical celebrations such as the Mass with great music and incense, no longer seeing an external drama in the sanctuary, but one which found its correspondence or resonance within me as well. And it left me forever changed.
A lot of your work, Eugene, has been about spirituality and wholeness. This seems to me to connect very, very closely to the idea of spirituality and health.
Yeah, I've written books on spirituality, but oftentimes it struck me that what you are promoting in the individual is really spiritual health, and probably the key point is where the ego holds. I imagine that most people who are dealing psychologically and so on with various illnesses, that the crucial point is their attitude to self. Are they wedded to self? Is the ego the big thing in my life? And you know, there are very many examples of selfish people, self-centered people, etc. We have wars that have been started by megalomaniacs like Stalin and Hitler and so on, blatant examples. But even among good people, I've struck this among, say, priests or religious who are very active in the church, and they've got a reputation for being, you know, high up and so on. But the way some individuals have managed to make it all revolve around themselves, I think that's a tragedy, that they've been able to get away with doing good things and getting good reputation, but in fact it's all about themselves, a kind of narcissism, a spiritual narcissism. And I read a book by Ruth Burrows called The Essence of Prayer, and she hits on that too, that this is a big, big danger, a spiritual disease in fact, and it can cloak it with all sorts of good works and seemingly being a very pastoral person. So I think what is good for spiritual health is also good for personal health.
I think I would like to add that I never aimed at this stage to no antiretroviral drugs or anything approaching healing in a psychological or even a mental sense, if you're talking about curing a disease or an infection, but a movement towards wholeness. And I had to empty myself out. I would come away day after day after day feeling absolutely burnt out and exhausted. but I had to be totally present for that person, sometimes for hours, as they passed away. It was an emptying of self rather than a aggrandisement of self.
I'm involved with an interfaith group here in the mountains, and I've been very interested in the way we've developed from the polite, courteous level, and we've now been able to go down deep into each of our religions, and seeing a lot of a common aspiration, put it that way. But all the major religions speak about the need for self-denial, which means saying no to self. It doesn't necessarily mean mortification or fasting or things like that, but some way we have to look at ourselves and say, no, I stand for something else. And there's someone else who's got to be on the pedestal in my life rather than me. And that's what spirituality is about, and that's what mental health is about, I think.
David, there's a very famous book, I can't remember what year it was, late 60s maybe, by Philip Reif, who was Susan Sontag's husband, called
Triumph of the Therapeutic.
The Triumph of the idea is that we're actually
1966.
We're living in a therapeutic paradigm now, where health and self-actualisation and so on, that's actually the driving force that's we're left with. And brilliant book. I'd love to know what you think about it. But
well, it is a brilliant book, but it's actually quite a cynical book because Philip Reif was writing from a position of disbelief, and he was both commenting on the triumph of the therapeutic but also highly critical of it. I thought it was a fascinating book. It's a book that warrants rereading. It's a great classic. I love it, but I also don't like it because his basic position is that we are now so concerned with ourselves that nothing much else matters, just the therapy of the self. But as Eugene's just said, the denial of self is really a central pillar of every spiritual pathway. So here we have this paradox.
I think he was saying that's breaking down, of course.
We have this kind of paradox, which is that religion's saying you must deny yourself, and Jesus says deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow me, and yet on the other hand, spirituality is saying, particularly in terms of Kevin's work with the creation story, there's not just original sin, there's also original blessing. So as well as operating from a vision of original sin, we also have to operate from a sense that there is a God element in us, which is what Peter was getting at before. I
was trying.
No, you were getting there, and you were saying that all of us are saved, as it were, in inverted commas, to the extent that we are saved when we feel that we are connected to this divine spark. But Stephen, let me give you a little very short profile of where I'm coming from in spirituality and health. I was very moved by your biographical discussion, and all these things do have biographical or points of origination. They're not just ideas. About 15 years ago, sensing in the student community a longing for spirituality and a desire to explore it, I somewhat foolishly, perhaps courageously, or both, set up a course at my university just called Spirituality. Now, I didn't even know what the students meant by spirituality because I'm an old-fashioned person who still goes to church. And of course, for them, spirituality means something very different. So I set this up, ran it for about 10 years, and in the last few years, I noticed something, which is that of the hundreds and hundreds of students who enrolled in spirituality course, most of them had suffered. They'd either had experience before their time, which was one of Peter's comments. They were wise before their time. In fact, talk about Jung, it threw Jung's theory out the window. Jung's view is that we only start reaching for God in the second half of life. I was dealing with 17 and 18-year-olds who were grappling with these so-called second half of life questions as teenagers. So, in other words, that part of Jung's theory is completely dated. I think the second half of
Can I just interrupt you there, Art? do you think that's the case in general, or were you dealing? Is it your view that younger people tend to be grappling in that way only when they have?
Look, I think Jung's theory is still valid for those people who live normal lives. But how many people live normal lives?
Right.
How many people have 35 to 40 years of uninterrupted ego development and then
without
bang,
pain or suffering?
Bang, without pain or suffering. This doesn't happen anymore.
Jung wasn't writing in the age of narcissism either.
No. But so these poor kids, they get hammered. Their parents are broken up, the family's dispersed. They move from Melbourne to Sydney or Perth, somewhere else. They get discombobulated and they start feeling at odds with themselves, and then they realise they have to find a deeper dimension to live from. So, and this is what I found marvellous about Kevin's book. You said in your book, Kevin, that religion, for too long we've been wearing religion as a persona identity, and now it has to be linked to the inner self, not just the mask. That's the kind of convulsion that's happening in religion at the moment. So here I was with hundreds of students, and then I started surveying them quite anonymously. I found that some of them had teenage depression. Some of them had suicidal thoughts and ideation. Some of them had and still had anxiety and anxiety attacks, panic attacks, chronic fatigue syndrome, all kinds of things which are not purely and simply to do with a bacterial or viral cause. And that in the last few years of teaching this course, the number of students who had unfortunate mental health experiences was as high as 78%. Of them. 78% of my cohort had problems with mental health. So coming back to your question, Stephen, I think that for those people who have had disrupted lives, spirituality becomes an urgent personal issue much more quickly. For those people who still have that idyllic Jungian life where they first 35, 40 years uninterrupted, then the so-called midlife crisis kicks in. But what and the media makes a joke of the midlife crisis these days, but it's very real for a lot of people. But what I saw was the quarter life crisis. That is to say, people at 15, 16, 17 who had gone through a crisis, and the depth from these people, and that's why, I've just met Peter today, and it's lovely to meet you, Peter. But
thank you.
What you're saying about your patients is what exactly I can say about my students. That is that, I'm supposed to be their teacher, but I learned from them. I learned their suffering. I learned how they've coped with suffering. I learned why spirituality is so vitally important for them. And the most heartbreaking thing of all, I learned that the churches aren't interested in their spirituality because it's not stamped religion. You see? It's not, or to quote our New South Wales poet Les Murray, what we have received is the ordinary mail of the other world, wholly common, not postmarked divine.
Can I just pick you up there? I will come to you, Kevin, but just on that exact point.
Yes.
In your experience in St Vincent's, the nuns are obviously a big presence, or were in
the nuns were marvellous.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But my question to you is, was official religion able to provide anything that these people needed?
Apart from the nuns, I'll give you a very quick anecdote. There was one dreadful day at St Vincent's that happened in San Francisco as well, where there were Ward 17 South. There were many men lying in beds, attached to drips. Their meals were left outside the room. No one would take their meals into them. I took their meals into them. I was probably the only psychologist in Sydney working in the HIV/AIDS era in those days. Where were the clergy? The only clergy who would visit these people who were dying and needing the Vatican, to the last rites, confession, the communion, were the Vincentians, and I think they've largely gone out of existence now, but by and large the clergy stayed away. The nuns, beautiful in their presence and connection with the divine within themselves, were there at the bedsides with me. That's why I want to make a case, have wanted to make a case, at least by mention today, of the importance of the feminine within ourselves, within us men, the anima side of ourselves, and in society generally, to give women a role.
The actor Rupert Everett
Yes.
wrote the most beautiful piece the other day in the the Evening Standard, the Weekly Standard, whatever English newspaper, about the gay revolution. And he'd been asked to Russell Brand, the comedian, was editing that section and asked him to write a piece. And the very end of the piece was the most beautiful tribute to women. And it was something along the lines of, they danced with us under the mirror ball while their husbands or boyfriends fumed, and they held our hands in the darkest night. And he talked about the way that the feminist revolution and the gay revolution had been absolutely tied together. But it was about this amazing sharing of joy and suffering.
Yes.
That gay men had a special connection with women along that line. I think it's the most wonderful tribute. We've left you out, Kevin. Just quickly, one way in is to something that David's talking about in his book is the re-shamanisation of medicine. Yeah. It occurs to me to just make the connection with the Jesus story, that we often forget that it's healing. Certainly in Mark's Gospel, healing is at the centre of the story. And always healing about being made whole.
I won't develop, but just quickly, resonating with Peter too, I was diagnosed with bowel cancer this year, and I've just come out a month ago from 7 months of chemotherapy. So, it's a very relevant topic, this, and I thought a lot about in David's marvellous book that I read it a second time, about the healing and being there in Wesley Hospital since February with people beside me, all getting their chemo, about how we were all facing up in different ways to the healing and what it meant in my spiritual life. And it's once again life in abundance, I would see everything religiously about the life in abundance. The healing weren't sort of miracles in one sense. It was everything that's not whole. Like Jesus comes down from the mountain in Mark 8, and the leper says, if you want to, you can make me clean. And Jesus says, of course I want to be cleansed. The whole of my life is about bringing wholeness, shalom, redemption, yes, salvation towards wholeness. That's God's desire. That's why you have this lovely image of the Eden principle that's within us. We long for the Palestinians and the Israelites to find peace. And so healing, psychological, spiritual, physical healing is all about that. And I must say, I thought about that one. And that, if I could, I know the time is there. A key icon for me that I carry around everywhere is the icon of Sophia, wisdom. Because I believe a lot of what we're saying today, we're almost suffocating with information, with internet and Facebook and Twitter and everything. But like as T.S. Eliot said, we have the knowledge, but to have the wisdom to live creatively. And that's what I believe is an urgent need today in everything we're talking about, to have the wisdom with all that's coming to us to sort out what's real, who are we in this world, and who is God.
And isn't that a problem with the Orthodox Church? You asked where the clergy were. Where were these icons of Christ who refused, unlike Jesus, I believe, to enter the rooms where people were dying, even to hand them their meals, left to the nuns and to people like myself, with a few exceptions?
One thing I'd like to raise, though, Kevin, and just come back to something that Peter said. Healing should not be confused with cure.
Absolutely.
That, you see, this is an important misconception in the community, and people sometimes ask me to speak at conferences, on spirituality and health, and I'm not in the business of cure. I mean, look, miracle cures do happen, and cancer can be in remission, and all sorts of marvellous things do happen. But that's the other side. That's the other side of the veil, as it were. That's God's work. On our side of the veil, we can prepare ourselves for healing. And I think, Peter, from what you said about your work with HIV/AIDS patients, that
Yes.
you can be healed but still die.
That's right.
And so this is a very important point. I go to a number of conferences where particularly New Age charlatans get up, and they actually, there's a snake oil people, they're kind of offering spirituality as a cure-all, like the medieval snake oil people. And that if you go to their church or follow their particular cult or sect or something, that you'll be cured of all your ills. Now, this is just delusional. But what we're talking about is healing as distinct from curing. And healing means embracing the wholeness, which of course relates to the word holiness of one's condition, facing your Creator, facing your Maker, becoming as reconciled to your suffering as possible, and doing that with full heart, with a sense of fullness and not a sense of having been a failure and a wretched defeat. That is what healing is. And all I can say is, if that results in cure, good luck to you, mate. But if it doesn't result in cure, don't lose heart and don't feel that your spirituality has been unsuccessful because you have 2 weeks to live.
When you've seen the light leaving the beds and the serenity in the faces of people who've been contorted with terror, that is its own reward. It's almost an experience of one's own redemption vicariously. I died on an operating table in August 2005, had a near-death experience. That took me even closer and into a more convinced experience of something numinous. But it took that and, terrible complications of bypass surgery. I now have a 2-inch scar down here from a wound that dehisced from gastrointestinal bleeding as a complication. It took that to bring me into an experience not of a cure, but of a kind of a fuller experience of wholeness that some people might say, well, is that holiness? I have no idea. But it's certainly an experience of wholeness, and it's that part of me I realised in retrospect that I took into the dying people in their wards at St Vincent's.
Yeah.
Would you like to make one concluding gesture to the assembled community before we round it all up?
Well, just a little story. One stage I was highly involved with charismatic renewal, and it was a time when we used to run around everywhere praying for cures, you see. Yeah. And there was one of my old teachers I heard was dying of cancer, and she was a nun, Josephite. So I went there with the intention of praying for the cure, you see. I went into the room and she had such a radiance on her face, and I couldn't pray for her. She was already living the resurrection, and that's what the resurrection is about.
Thank you all.